Great. Well, yeah, just kind of reiterating what you talked about with the loans. You mentioned how, that's super hard to attain. And then the environmental racism as well. That's often not talked about with kind of the placement of each house. And then the temporary housing in place of the floods.
Yeah.
And then also I-77 you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of sounds to me like there's so many tiny laws and stuff that like the average person doesn't really know about, but it's really just kind of written in stone. One of the things you mentioned also was the other side of the tracks.
Yes.
I actually noticed this. So I was crossing to go to the Herd Hub and back and forth there, and then it was mentioned by, I think I went to Rayford's barbershop and did a little tiny interview or question about that, and they mentioned how it's often kind of separates like the white side and almost the black side, and I was just a little bit curious more about, the concept of that and what that represents.
And really, that is segregation. And a lot of North Carolina communities, and we'll see in the South, especially in North Carolina, with mills. So we were a mill town too, so where the Hurt Hub is a former mill. So that also talks about you also have a divide between working class white people and African Americans too, from the wealthier on the tracks as well. But the ones for white working class, they tend to be more closer and still have access where they can come across the tracks. African Americans on the other side, it really determines on where they find community. And one of the things you can tell of our side in the tracks is in the heart of the black community, the church is right there, right on the link. And there's several churches. And so you start seeing the anchors of community in these centralized places and then the houses around. But that track is that line where you can work on this side at the college. And on Main Streets, including the barbershops, like Rayford Barbershop and stuff on Main Street, but then you cross the track to go home. And that's where there was a black-owned grocery store attempted by Ralph Johnson. That'll be on that side. It's didn't survive more than 15 years, but that was where it was a separate black world. And what happens with that is, in these communities that are segregated because of the law, and everything's in those spaces, we have where most people didn't realize how different things were. That there's economic issues and environmental racism because everyone goes back to their bubble. And so these little laws become informal practices that people don't feel that they can come across the track because they don't belong there. So you have to do that with purpose, but when you go back across into your home space, you have your neighbors who are part of your church members, your school members and stuff like that. So you have this really a communal grouping, and so, but the tracks will also see, the houses will all look the same. Everyone's struggling on terms of infrastructure. Everyone's taking care of one another, that mutual aid in society, little gardens. So people are able to rely more on one another than they are expecting because they live on one side of the tracks. And in this system of segregation, that everyone's living some form of poverty or barely eking through. And they have then pride in their communities and housing and trying to improve as much as they can. But those realities of not being able to improve their homes by getting loans. And I think those informal practices that are no longer there. So we don't have formal segregation anymore, but we definitely have where people don't feel comfortable because of the long histories. So one of the things I know that the college has done in working with the town of Davidson and addressing some of these lingering, not so much structural issues, but that still those informal enforcement of those previous structural issues, if you can, using Ada Jenkins and thinking about infrastructure loans and grants, other ways to do improvements, but that's all not formal and can end at any time, and it's dependent on people giving money, grants, and things like that, and then having Ada Jenkins as like the clearinghouse for people to go to. that's not sustainable change.
Right. Yeah.
And not everyone can get access to that's when opportunities are being done. And that's where I think where we continue to have the ongoing housing issues, because it's so systemic and we're doing band-aids.
Right.
Rather than actual,
doesn't heal the wound. Yeah.
it's what needs to be done to heal that wound and these previous traumas around housing will require innovation. And also money, like innovation and money. So I think in the end, we're still working out the issues around housing that goes back to Jim Crow.
Right.
And that longer history is something that I'm more mindful of in my classes, but I also talk about the realities of go to Zillow, go look at how much it was actually buy a house in Davidson right now.
Definitely.
And think about where people live, and if they're older and on retirement and on a limited income, what are their options? And especially because they have pride in their homes.
Right.
What does that mean? And then also, can their grandchildren afford to live in Davidson?
Yeah.
So we're seeing, because of housing, shrinking older Black community and Latino community, and the younger generations don't live here because they can't afford to live here.
Right. Wow, that's, it's generational, is what I can see. Definitely. Wow, well, I definitely want to be mindful of your time, but there are a couple of questions. Definitely thank you for answering the sustainable change question about, just innovation, money, and just working around that. I'm also just curious about kind of where we are right now, actually, because I actually haven't heard of the Carolina Inn, and I did a little bit of research before, and then this was built in like the 1800s.
Yes, it was.
And how it's like a hotel, and I was just kind of wondering, at least about that, given that we're sitting in it, how did this space, if you know of, function during segregation? And I'm guessing Black residents or travelers.
Yeah, could not say here.
Yeah, could not, yeah.
So one of the things about this building, this is one of our historic buildings on campus that the Helper family, because they're the ones who first built this house, using enslaved people in labor, because this is, then they converted to a hotel.
Wow.
So early in its history, within a decade of it being built, this is serving as a hotel for people traveling to Davidson. So any speaker that comes to campus, any family who needs a space, because there's no hotels. Right. So this is the hotel.
Yeah.
And they always had African American employees from slavery and then after the war as paid employees, and we have pictures of them coming in. One of the things we're in segregation though, this is a white only hotel. Served with Black waiters and butlers, and also a family so it's also family run, so it's still in the family. But one of the things about this space is tied to the college. As an all-male college, this is where women from Queens would come for when there would be fraternity house parties and fraternity parties because women had to stay here.
Yeah.
So this is where the women attending our frat parties would stay. For graduation, this is where families would come in to stay.
Oh, wow.
And then the college acquires this in the mid-1940s, 50s, around there. And they turned this into kind of like an office space, kind of still some visiting guests, they needed a space, and the guest house was not being used. Would still use the space, but then it really functioned more as an academic space, where offices would occur upstairs, like where we are now, but downstairs in that open area, That would be used for a variety of functions for students to have like a lounge space. And during segregation, white high school students on Friday night and Saturday night got to use downstairs as their teen canteen.
Wow. Oh, wow.
And for the black community, they went across the tracks to the church that's there. They have that little sidewalk, that's their canteen.
Oh, wow.
So it's literally
Really cross.
like black students, children in the town could not use the canteen. It's segregated by race.
Wow.
And so this space transforms when we have our first black students on our campus. So the admission of Ben, and then others on the year, and this is more and more for academics. This is when you really see people are in, African Americans are in here not just as the cleaning staff,
Right.
but now as students and faculty.
Wow.
So this history is one of those ongoing changes and transformation.
Right.
But also I think about now, when I meet with community members, including those from West Davidson and Cornelius,
Yeah.
this was not a space for them. And they remember when the canteen was here and it was
Wow.
only for white children. But that's where we have our community meetings sometimes in here on that lower level
Yeah.
to talk about the memorial and other changes. So it's still a gathering space, but it's a transformed gathering space than where it was previously.
Wow, that's incredible. I think that's so inspiring, especially now to see, amazing people like you, and just like the new generation from a place that, only cleaning staff and just that's definitely super important to me. And I did have kind of one more follow-up question. So I guess it's kind of a two-part, but in relation to what you said, do you think that, I know you talked earlier about the change that the school is making and how, while it is like lots of change, how it's not necessarily sustainable. Do you think that the college is overall improving, or are we seeing like upward trend towards that real change? And then also, tying it back into you, I did like a little bit of research and saw that you were an incredible author. I think one book, Unforgettable Sacrifice, talking about black communities remembered in the Civil War, which looked really powerful, and just kind of wondering the overlap between black communities preserve Civil War memory and how they remember or talk about local struggles or neighborhood history. So it's kind of a big part question, but
and so the first part about change in the college, yes, but slow, and that's typical of here. We don't do anything fast. But one of the things I think where in terms of housing, we can do more.
Yeah.
And this is where I think innovation can matter. And one of the ways I would look at this is going back to our roots in with the students in the YMCA and trying to create sustainable housing for employees.
Right.
We still have African American employees on our campus from all levels.
Yeah.
And we also have a land lease program for faculty, which there's not enough houses for even faculty to take advantage of that.
Wow.
If we build new housing, can we have where staff members, not just faculty members, get access? And that means we need not just townhouses, but apartment complexes, like for actual faculty and staff members.
Right.
And I think that's the type of innovation that can be done. Okay, if you are staff and you work here and you need not even a 1-bedroom, because the hardest is a 2-bedroom and a 3-bedroom, because people have families.
Right. Having
1 to 3 bedrooms where if you are employed at Davidson and under certain incomes, these are houses you can actually have that and maintain. That might actually cause some of the most immediate struggle that we have. It is super expensive to live here.
Right.
And our wages haven't caught up with the continuing increase in pricing of our housing. And that will lead to worker satisfaction, but also changes some of the dynamics, because past and present, most of the African American community in Davidson work for the college.
Yeah.
So if we know they work for the college and historically work for the college, this is where if we do anything on housing and being innovative with the land that we have and our resources that we have,
Definitely.
This might be one step that we can do. But I know the college has done things with infrastructure grants and through Ada Jenkins, and they don't always advertise it because it's not all the time, but they have been doing some of that work. And also thinking about when asbestos was in the mill area and helping families really try to deal with that past. And also their gardens had to have the EPA in.
Yeah,
type of thing. So what does that mean psychologically, and having spaces for students of play and different things on campus for them? So that's one of the things I think we can do more, but we have been doing stuff along the way. So progress on our time is typical, slow and steady. We are slow and steady.
Definitely.
And then on the book Unforgettable Sacrifice, one of the things that I see is the Davidson community reminds me of the communities that I research. For them, it's not so much the Civil War and the war itself. It's the Civil War and ending slavery. Because for our part of the state, but also for many of the families who worked on the plantations in this area, the war ended meant they were free. And their relationship to the college went from labor where their enslavers got paid but they did not, to now they're getting paid in wages. And a lot of the generations of families that live in West Davidson and our surrounding communities of Smithfield and Pottstown and Mooresville now became long-term employees of the college.
Wow.
And they were able to buy those first houses because their salaries was sufficient enough to buy those houses.
Right.
Ralph Johnson, where James Rayford first worked for his barbershop, his uncle Toby was born into slavery, but he worked for the college as a servant, and so in that 1895 picture, you see Toby there.
Wow.
And then he opens up the first black-owned business on Main Street.
Wow.
He does the laundry before the college has a laundry. He's able to buy property, operate that business, catering to the students, and builds a lovely house that he then gives to his nephew.
Wow.
And through sale, like that type of thing is that upward mobility.
Right.
So for the Black community and the communities they remember the war and what it allowed them to do. So emancipation is how they remember the war.
Right.
Where other communities, like not just more so non-Southern communities where slavery was not reality that they had to work on.
Right.
They talk about the war meant that they got to serve, but they also got to change the country and be voting men and having like rights.
Right.
And that's something that unifies all of them. So the Davidson community and that sacrifice, I think the Civil War era is so important for them because they never forget that sacrifice.
Right.
Who's doing the sacrifice? Whose shoulders are they building on?
Mm-hmm.
And that ongoingness and keeping those oral traditions and keeping the churches and keeping those spaces is how they remember the Civil War as a break. We were no longer slaves anymore.
Yeah.
And keep on going. And that part is so powerful because for West Davidson in particular, they are no longer slaves who worked on our campus.
Definitely.
They are now employees.
Yeah, right.
And then they can use that to give their children access to an education outside of the state and go to the HBCUs, including Johnson C. Smith, is where a lot of our former enslaved people will send their kids. Barbara Scotia, which is was an all-women's college, Presbyterian, they'll send their kids to there because we're a Presbyterian school. So they'll hit all the Presbyterian colleges.
Right.
And for them, you get your education because under slavery and before the Civil War, we couldn't do this. Right. Now you're doing this.
Now we're doing
so that's the constant way you can have the change and where those communities remember it by land ownership and education.
Right.
In the church. Those are the three things, and we still see those three things today.
Wow. Land ownership, the church, and education.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, wow. That's so important. Well, thank you so much for all of your time. This has been incredible to talk about. And it's really blown my mind. So
this is the thing at this point, because you'll be here for the dedication of the memorial.
Okay, yeah.
So see that blue top there?
Yes.
That building in between?
Okay.
That's around. That's gonna be a museum.
Oh, really?
And it's gonna talk more about the history of the people. And then the memorial's gonna be on the other side of that.
Wow.
So you get to see, that's what I mean by slow and steady.
Yeah.
We're just slow.
Yeah, definitely. In the works still.
It's in the works.
In the works. Wow, well, that's super cool to see and
Yes.
hear about. Thank you so much
No
for talking
problem.
to me.
Good luck with your project.
Thank you. Hope you have an amazing day.
Oh, I will. But my thing is that